Genevieve, I never expected to see you here. Life rarely follows our expectations, Your Grace.
I've thought about that day for an entire year.
Then perhaps you've had enough time to understand it.
He spent 365 days convincing himself he made the practical choice. He chose the estate, the legacy, over the woman who smelled of ink and damp earth. But when she walked into the ballroom, every justification he had built instantly turned to ash in his mouth. The Harrington ballroom was suffocating. 300 bodies packed into a space designed for two, illuminated by thousands of beeswax candles that dripped slowly into crystal catchers. The air was thick with the scent of heavy musks, roasting meats from the dining hall below, and the faint, sour tang of nervous sweat. Arthur Pendelton, the Duke of Westford, stood rigidly beside a marble pillar, staring at a plaster cherub on the ceiling. His cravat felt like a garrote. Beside him, Lord Oakhaven was droning on about the rising costs of iron ore and the delays in the canal constructions, the exact sort of conversations Arthur had supposedly sacrificed his soul to secure. "It comes down to simple mathematics, Westford," Oakhaven said, swirling a glass of lukewarm port. "One cannot build a foundation on sentiment. One must build it on capital." "Quite right," Arthur murmured. His voice sounded hollow, scraping against the back of his throat. He took a sip of his own drink, letting the burn of the alcohol mask the dull, persistent ache behind his ribs. He had learned a lot about foundations in the past year. When he inherited the dukedom, he hadn't inherited a fortune. He had inherited a facade. Behind the velvet curtains and the ancestral portraits lay crippling debts, rotting tenant farms, and a ledger written entirely in red ink. To save it, he had spent the last 12 months selling off everything that wasn't legally nailed down by entailment. He sold the London townhouse, his grandfather's racing horses, and the Renaissance oils in the gallery. And 12 months ago, he had sold out Genevieve. He closed his eyes against the glare of the chandeliers, but the memory was sharp enough to draw blood. He remembered the exact draftiness of his study. He remembered the smell of the old leather chair he gripped to keep his hands from shaking. He remembered how Genevieve had looked, standing on the faded Turkish rug in her mended woolen pelisse, holding a portfolio of her botanical illustrations against her chest like a shield. "I cannot marry you, Genevieve," he had said. His voice in the memory was terrifyingly flat. "The estate is bankrupt. If I do not marry an heiress, 200 families on my land will starve by winter. I cannot afford a heart." She hadn't cried. That was the thing that haunted him most. She hadn't screamed or thrown things. She had simply looked at him, her dark eyes entirely clear, and absorbed the blow. "I see," she had whispered. She set a small wrapped parcel on his desk, a birthday gift she had spent weeks making for him. "Then, I suppose this is goodbye, Arthur." She walked out into the freezing November rain, and he had let her. He had sat at his desk, staring at the ledgers, while the sound of her carriage wheels faded onto the gravel drive. He never married the heiress. He couldn't stomach the thought when the time came. Instead, he had bled himself dry, working 18-hour days, tearing down the bloated household staff and managing the farms himself. The estate was surviving, barely, but the house was entirely, deafeningly empty. A sudden, sharp change in the atmosphere pulled Arthur back to the present. It didn't happen all at once. It started near the grand double doors at the top of the sweeping staircase. The string quartet was still scraping out a waltz, but the underlying hum of 300 voices suddenly fractured. A wave of silence rippled outward, fast and absolute, like a fire consuming dry grass. Heads turned. Fans stopped fluttering midair. Even Lord Oakhaven cut off in the middle of a sentence about iron tariffs, his jaw going slack. Arthur turned his head, irritated by the interruption. He looked toward the landing. The glass in his hand slipped. He caught it just before it shattered on the parquet floor, the liquor splashing over his knuckles, soaking cold into his gloves. It was Genevieve. She stood at the top of the stairs, waiting for the major domo to announce her. But the major domo A man with 30 years of unflappable experience seemed to have lost his voice. She was not the impoverished country doctor's daughter in the mended pelisse. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue silk, completely devoid of the lace and ruffles, favored by the season's debutantes. It was stark, architectural, and undeniably expensive. Her dark hair, which she used to tie back with a simple ribbon, was woven with tiny pearls and pinned up in a complex style that bared the long, elegant line of her neck. But it wasn't the clothes that paralyzed the room. It was her posture. She held herself with an unyielding, grounded calm. There was no desperate seeking of approval in her eyes, no nervous twitch of her hands. She looked down at the glittering, judgmental mass of London society as if they were a particularly uninteresting species of beetle she had found in her garden. "Good God," Oakhaven breathed. Is that the Hale girl? The one who was companion to old Lady Titchfield?" "Yes," Arthur said. He didn't recognize his own voice. "I heard the rumors, but I thought it was drawing-room gossip," Oakhaven muttered, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with the predatory calculation of the ton. Her great-uncle, in Calcutta, the shipping magnate, he died childless, left her everything. They say she's worth £600,000. She's bought out half of Mayfair. Arthur heard the words, but they didn't make sense. £600,000. She was entirely autonomous. She needed no one. The major domo finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly as he struck his staff against the marble. "Miss Genevieve Hale." As she began to descend the stairs, the silence shattered, replaced immediately by a frantic, buzzing hive of whispers. Society matrons who had once crossed the street to avoid the dirt from Genevieve's worn hem were suddenly shoving their daughters aside, calculating introductions. Men who had laughed at her plain dresses were straightening their waistcoats. Arthur couldn't breathe. The physical space between his ribs felt as though it were shrinking. Every step she took down the staircase felt like a nail being driven into the floorboards of his chest. He expected her to look overwhelmed. He wanted her to look, just for a second, toward the corner where she knew he usually stood, seeking the familiar. She didn't. She reached the bottom of the stairs and was immediately intercepted by the hostess, Lady Harrington, who was beaming with an obsequious smile that bordered on a grimace. Genevieve smiled back a small, polite curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Arthur shoved his half-empty glass onto a passing footman's tray with enough force to make the silver rattle. "Excuse me, Oakhaven," Arthur said, already moving. "Westford, don't be a fool," the older man hissed, grabbing Arthur's sleeve. "You've got nothing to offer a woman like that now, not with your books in the state they are. She'll carve you up." Arthur pulled his arm free, without breaking his gaze from the midnight blue silk moving through the crowd. "Let her." The ballroom floor was a minefield of silk trains, sharp elbows, and defensive posturing. As Arthur moved through the crowd, he felt the distinct shift in the room's attention. A year ago, he was the Duke of Westford, the premier catch of the season, despite the whispers of his debts. Now, he was the man who had publicly discarded the woman who currently held the undisputed attention of every peer in London. The whispers tracked his progress. He ignored them. He kept his eyes locked on Genevieve. She had moved toward the terrace doors, presumably to escape the oppressive heat. A cluster of ambitious younger sons and desperate lords had formed a barricade around her, offering glasses of lemonade, eager smiles, and transparent flattery. Arthur didn't excuse himself as he broke the perimeter. He simply used his height and his shoulders, stepping into the circle with a heavy, uncompromising stride. The chatter died instantly. 3 young lords stepped back, their expressions caught between indignation and intimidation. Genevieve was in the middle of adjusting the clasp of her glove. She finished, smoothing the fabric over her wrist before she finally looked up at him. Up close, the changes in her were not just material. The soft, Tired smudges under her eyes from staying up late mixing ink and copying illustrations were gone. Her skin was clear, her gaze steady. She smelled different too. The scent of damp earth and crushed rosemary was gone, replaced by something subtle, expensive, and cold, like cut stems and frost. "Miss Hale," Arthur said. The two words scraped out of him. He had practiced 100 different apologies in the dark of his empty house over the last year. He had written letters and burned them in the grate. But now, standing 2 feet from her, his mind was entirely blank. "Your Grace," Genevieve replied. Her voice was perfectly modulated. There was no tremor, no anger, no hesitation. She spoke to him exactly as she would speak to a shopkeeper who had handed her the wrong parcel. "It is unexpected to see you here," Arthur managed, hating how clumsy his tongue felt. "I had not realized you returned to London." "I returned 3 weeks ago," she said smoothly. She didn't offer any further explanation. She didn't ask how he was. She simply looked at him, waiting for him to finish whatever social obligation he felt he was fulfilling, so she could move on. The apathy in her eyes was devastating. If she had glared at him, if she had turned her back, it would have meant there was still a wound. But a wound that is healed leaves only a scar, dead to the touch. "You look well, Genevieve," he said, stepping a fraction of an inch closer, lowering his voice so the vultures surrounding them couldn't hear. She didn't retreat, but her chin lifted a fraction. "Miss Hale, Your Grace." The correction was a physical blow. Arthur's jaw clenched tight enough to grind the enamel of his teeth. "Miss Hale, I am entirely well. I find the climate of the city much more agreeable when one does not have to walk through the mud to traverse it," she said. It wasn't a jab at him. It was a simple statement of fact. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging the men who were awkwardly hovering. "Gentlemen, would you excuse us for a moment?" "Do." The younger lords scattered like frightened pigeons. They were left standing in a small pocket of isolation near the glass terrace doors. The cold draft leaked through the panes, chilling the sweat on Arthur's neck. "You did not come to the ball to discuss my health, Westford," she said, dropping the polite pretense the moment they were out of earshot. "What is it you want?" "A public confirmation that there is no bad blood between us, so your reputation remains unblemished. Consider it given. You may go back to your corner." "I didn't come over here for my reputation," Arthur said harshly. The defensive anger was a reflex, a shield against the crushing weight of his regret. "I came because He stopped. He looked at her collarbone, at the heavy, flawless diamond resting against her skin. "I came because my house is a tomb. I came because I haven't slept a full night in 12 months. I wanted to see you. You have seen me." Genevieve's expression didn't flicker. "And now I must ask you to step aside. I am expecting someone." Arthur froze. "Expecting someone?" "Yes," a new voice said. A man stepped out from the terrace shadows. He was tall, perhaps an inch shorter than Arthur, with the broad, solid build of a man who spent his life outdoors rather than at card tables. He had warm, intelligent eyes and a quiet confidence that immediately put Arthur's teeth on edge. He wore evening clothes, but they looked comfortable on him. "Lived in." "I apologize for the delay, Genevieve," the man said, stepping smoothly to her side. He did not ask for permission to use her Christian name. He handed her a glass of chilled water, not the sickly sweet lemonade the others had offered. "The crush at the refreshment tables is nearing a riot." "Thank you, Mr. Carlyle," Genevieve said. When she looked at the newcomer, her face transformed. The severe, architectural mask dissolved. The corners of her eyes crinkled. The smile she gave him was entirely real. It was the smile she used to give Arthur when he brought her a new set of brushes. Arthur felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking. Carlyle finally turned his attention to Arthur. He didn't look intimidated. He looked mildly curious. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Edmund Carlyle." He extended a hand. Arthur stared at the hand. Social convention dictated he take it. The feral, territorial instinct in his chest screamed at him to throw the man off the terrace. "Arthur Pendelton, Duke of Westford," Arthur said, forcing his hand forward to give a brief, hard shake. "Ah," Carlyle said softly. Recognition sparked in the man's eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked at Arthur with a profound, quiet pity. It was infinitely worse than hatred. "I have heard of you." "Have you?" Arthur replied, his voice dangerously low. "Only in passing," Carlyle said easily, turning his body slightly, angling himself between Arthur and Genevieve in a subtle, protective gesture. It wasn't aggressive, just absolute. "Genevieve, Lady Aris, is signaling from the card room. I believe she requires rescuing from Lord Harrington's stories about the Peninsular War." "We should go, then," Genevieve said. She looked back at Arthur one last time. There was no lingering longing. There was no hidden message in her eyes. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. She placed her hand lightly on Carlyle's arm. They turned and walked away, slipping seamlessly into the crowd. The whispers immediately flared up again in their wake, a buzzing static in Arthur's ears. Arthur stood entirely alone by the frost-covered glass of the terrace door. The cold seeped through his coat, settling deep into his bones. He watched her midnight blue dress disappear into the sea of people, realizing with a sickening clarity that breaking her heart a year ago was only the first tragedy. The second tragedy was that she had learned how to live without him, and he was entirely certain he could not live without her. It took 3 days to find her outside the suffocating confines of Mayfair's ballrooms. Arthur did not sleep during those 72 hours. He spent the nights sitting in the heavy leather chair of his study, staring at the small, wrapped parcel Genevieve had left on his desk a year ago. The brown paper was worn at the corners where he had run his thumb over it, day after day. He had never opened it. Opening it meant accepting the finality of her absence. He found her on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at Somerset House, attending the Royal Botanical Society's spring exhibition. The gallery was quiet, smelling of damp wool coats, beeswax floor polish, and old paper. The crowd was sparse, consisting mostly of elderly academics and quiet enthusiasts. Genevieve was standing before a large, framed lithograph of a rare bracken fern, entirely absorbed. She wore a simple day dress of dark green wool, a stark contrast to the midnight silk from the ball, yet she commanded the space around her just the same. Mr. Carlyle was nowhere in sight. Arthur stopped a few feet away. The urge to close the distance was a physical ache in his legs, but he forced himself to remain still. He waited until she finished reading the placard, her eyes tracing the lines of the illustration. "The artist missed the venation on the lower fronds," Arthur said quietly. Genevieve didn't jump. She slowly turned her head. Her dark eyes swept over his damp riding coat and the mud caked on his boots. He hadn't bothered with a carriage. He had ridden straight through the miserable drizzle the moment he learned where she was. "He did," she agreed, her voice even. "He prioritized aesthetic symmetry over botanical accuracy. It renders the piece useless for actual study." She turned fully toward him, clasping her hands loosely in front of her. She didn't look angry, just terribly, distantly observant. "Where is your shadow?" Arthur asked, unable to keep the bitter edge entirely out of his voice. "Mr. Carlyle had business in the city," she replied. She held his gaze. "Why are you here, Arthur?" It was the first time she had used his Christian name since her return. The sound of it in her mouth hit him directly in the sternum. "To tell you the truth," Arthur said. He stepped closer, dropping his voice so the few patrons in the room couldn't hear. "The truth. I was too much of a coward to tell you 12 months ago." Genevieve's posture stiffened slightly. "You made yourself perfectly clear 12 months ago. Your estate required an influx of capital. I had none. The mathematics were quite simple. They were a death sentence, Arthur countered harshly, stepping into her space. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in, his voice vibrating with suppressed intensity. You saw the grand house. You saw the title. What I didn't tell you, what I was too humiliated to admit to the woman I loved, was that the foundation was completely rotten. My father left hundreds of thousands of pounds in gambling debts. The tenant farms in the north were starving because he hadn't repaired the grain silos in a decade. The roof of the east wing was caving in. Genevieve watched him, her expression unreadable. And you believed marrying an heiress would solve it. I believed I had a duty to the 200 families living on my land, Arthur said, the exhaustion of the past year leaking into his tone. I believed I couldn't drag you into a life of debt collectors and ruin. I thought I was protecting you. For the first time, a fracture appeared in her calm facade, her brow furrowed, and a flash of sharp, unmistakable anger flared in her eyes. Protecting me, she repeated softly. The quietness of her voice was far more devastating than a shout. You thought I was made of spun glass. I am a country doctor's daughter, Arthur. I have set broken bones and stretched a week's wages to feed a household for a month. I knew what poverty looked like. Not this kind of poverty, Arthur insisted, his hands clenching at his sides. Not the kind that destroys a family name. Not the kind that strips you of every shred of dignity. So you stripped me of my agency instead, Genevieve said. The words fell between them, heavy and absolute. Arthur stopped. The air in his lungs seemed to evaporate. You did not break my heart because you were poor, Arthur, she continued, her voice trembling, just enough to show the raw edge beneath the steel. You broke it because you looked at our life, looked at the ruin you faced, and decided I was not strong enough to stand in the ash with you. You shut the door in my face because you did not trust me to help you carry the burden. She stepped past him, the dark green wool brushing against his damp coat. Genevieve, he choked out, turning. She paused, looking over her shoulder. The anger had receded, leaving only a profound, weary sorrow. I did not need a duke in a grand house. I just needed a partner, and you proved you were not capable of being one. She walked toward the exit, leaving Arthur standing alone in the gallery, the silence ringing in his ears, completely and utterly shattered by the truth. Arthur did not return to Mayfair. He traded his tailored coats for heavy, waxed canvas, and his polished hessians for boots caked in northern clay. Over the next 3 weeks, he systematically dismantled the last rotting pillars of his father's administration. He stood knee-deep in freezing mud for 4 days, supervising the reconstruction of a collapsed grain silo. He fired the corrupt land agent who had been skimming tenant rents, doing it in the pouring rain in front of the village square. He sat in the drafty, foul-smelling warehouses by the Thames, negotiating raw iron prices with a ruthless, humorless logic that shocked the local merchants. His hands blistered. His back ached with a persistent dull throb, but he didn't endure it with the delusion of winning Genevieve back. The devastating clarity of her words in the gallery had killed any hope of a simple, romantic reconciliation. He did it because she had been entirely right. He had to clear the rot himself. A week later, a heavy brown paper parcel arrived at Genevieve's townhouse, just as the gas lamps were being lit against the evening fog. She sat by the hearth in her parlor, the firelight catching the rich mahogany of the furniture. Across the room, Edmund Carlyle sat in a wingback chair, nursing a glass of brandy. He was a good man, steady, intelligent, and fiercely respectful of her autonomy. 3 days ago, he had asked her to be his wife. He offered a life completely devoid of anxiety. She had asked for time to consider. Genevieve pulled the twine from the parcel. Inside was a massive, leather-bound master accounting ledger. The spine was cracked, the corners battered. She opened it to find pages filled with Arthur's sharp, hurried handwriting. It was a brutal, uncompromising autopsy of a dukedom. She tracked the liquidation of his grandfather's art collection, the staggering debt owed to the crown, and the painful, agonizingly slow column of repayments. He had hidden nothing. Tucked into the final pages was a familiar folded sheet of parchment. Her breath hitched. It was the birthday gift she had given him the day he ended their engagement. He had finally unwrapped it. It was a watercolor she had painted of the Westford estate, not crumbling, but repaired. Beneath the brushstrokes, in fresh, black ink, Arthur had written a single line. "You were right. I am building it from the ash. A. At 10 o'clock that night, a hired hackney carriage rattled to a halt outside a narrow, unremarkable brick building in Cheapside. Arthur sat at a small, scarred pine desk, rubbing his exhausted eyes over a map of drainage ditches. When the heavy knock sounded, he assumed it was the landlord. He pulled open the door, the cold night air biting at his face. Genevieve stood on the threshold. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking her heavy wool cloak and plastering her dark hair to her cheeks. She held the leather-bound ledger tight against her chest. Arthur's hand froze on the brass door handle. His heart slammed against his ribs. Genevieve. She stepped out of the freezing rain, forcing him to back up into the narrow, unlit hallway. She dropped the heavy ledger onto a rickety side table with a resounding thud. "Your arithmetic is entirely reckless," she said. Her voice was breathless, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Arthur stared at her, entirely disoriented by the smell of wet wool and cold rain filling his cramped lodgings. "What?" "Page 42, she said, stripping off her ruined, soaked gloves. "You projected the winter wheat yield based on the soil composition of the southern fields. The northern acreage has a heavy clay content. The yield will be at least 20% lower. If you base your crown loan repayments on these projections, you will default by November." Arthur looked from the puddles forming around her boots to the fierce, unyielding intelligence in her dark eyes. "You crossed London in a gale to correct my ledger?" "I crossed London," she said, stepping closer, "because you finally showed me the ledger." The defensive tension drained out of Arthur's shoulders, leaving only a profound exhaustion. "I wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to see that I am learning how to clean up my own ruin." "You showed me your hands dirty," she corrected softly. She closed the distance between them. "Edmund asked me to marry him." Arthur's throat constricted. The words felt like swallowing ground glass. "He is a decent man. He can offer you a life without this." He gestured vaguely to the damp walls and the open ledger. "I never asked for a life without burden, Arthur. I asked for a partner to carry it with." She reached out. Her cold, bare fingers touched his wrist, right over his hammering pulse. The contact sent a physical jolt straight through his chest. "Are you finally asking me to stand in the ash with you?" Arthur looked down at her. He didn't offer grand apologies. He didn't offer a title or wealth. He lifted his hand, his rough, calloused thumb, gently wiping a raindrop from her jawline. "I am asking you," he whispered, his voice thick with a year of buried grief, "to help me rebuild the house." Genevieve exhaled a long, shaky breath. The severe, untouchable mask she had worn since her return finally cracked. She leaned her weight into the warmth of his palm. "Then we have work to do. If you felt the ache of Arthur's regret and the quiet, unyielding strength of Genevieve's return, let me know by hitting the like button." Their journey proves that true partnership isn't found in perfect circumstances, but in the willingness to rebuild from the ash together. Share this story with someone who appreciates a deeply grounded romance, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more immersive, character-driven historical dramas every week. See you in the next chapter.